In this lecture, we're going to begin toggling the UI's display. Currently, all sections of the document appear on the screen. As the course progresses, we're going to continue to add more menus to our document. Displaying all elements would be overwhelming. It wouldn't provide for a good player experience. We can resolve these issues by hiding all elements. In our code, we can programmatically toggle the appearance of each section. First, let's hide all elements. In Unity, open the UI Builder for the main menu template. From the hierarchy, select the main menu container element. Next, in the inspector, search for the Display section from the inline styles. There's a setting called Display. We can hide the element by changing this setting to None. Let's apply the same setting to the Player Info container element. Great! Our elements have been successfully hidden from the player. Our next step is to display them based on the current scene and action. In your editor, open the UI controller component. First, we must select the elements from the component. While they're not visible, that doesn't mean we can't select them from the document. Unity is simply hiding them from the scene. As usual, we must perform a query. Let's define variables for storing references to the containers. At the top of the class, define a public variable called main menu container with the visual element class as the type. Define another variable called player info container. It'll have the same modifier and type as the previous variable. Both variables will store references to the elements from our document. Let's set their values during the awake method. At the bottom of this method, set the main menu container variable to the following value, root.q. I'm introducing a new method for querying the document. Previously, we executed the query method for selecting buttons from the document. The difference between both methods is the number of results. The query method will always select an array of elements, whereas the queue method selects the first element it finds. Behind the scenes, the queue method is running the query method. You can think of it as a shortcut for selecting the first result. Either method works, but I prefer to use the queue method when selecting a single element. The parameters for this method are the same as the query method. First, we must provide the type of element to select as a generic. Let's pass in the visual element class. Next, we must provide the name of the element to select. We can select elements by their names or classes. For the buttons, we use the class. This time, we're going to select the element by its name. In the first parameter, pass in the following value, main menu container. The name of the element must match the name from the document. Let's select the player info container element. Set the player info container variable to the following value, root.q visual element player info container. Perfect. We have selected both elements from our document. The last step is to toggle their display. Let's do so from the start method. As a reminder, I prefer to set up my variables during the awake method. I like to perform logic from the start method. This process is not required, but keeps our code base clean. In the start method, we must check the current scene. The main menu UI should appear while the player is on the main menu scene. Therefore, we should check the current scene before doing anything else. Scroll to the top of the file. Add the Unity Engine.Scene Management namespace. Let's head back to the start method. At the top of the method, create an integer variable called SceneIndex. Its value will be the following, SceneManager.getActiveScene.buildIndex. Once again, we're using the Scene Manager class to retrieve the current scene. We can grab the current scene's information by calling the getActiveScene method. This method returns multiple pieces of information on the current scene, such as the name. We're only interested in the index, which can be accessed via the build index property. You may be wondering, how do I know about the values returned from this method? That's a good question. Let me show you how I arrived at this information. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the getActiveScene method. The most important part of this documentation page is the return section. Unity documents the return value from this method. According to the documentation, a value with the scene type is returned. Reading further, there's a link to this class from the description. Let's click on it. We're brought to a documentation page with more information on this type. As you can see, the build index property is listed as a value found from this type. Reading the documentation can help you find this information. Learning how to read documentation is a critical skill to have under your belt. Let's head back to our editors. Next, we can start checking the index. As we know, the index for the main menu scene is 0. If the current scene has an index of 0, we can verify we're on the main menu scene. Add a conditional statement with the following condition: build index equals 0. If this condition evaluates to true, let's enter the main menu state. Move the code for entering the scene into the conditional statements block of code. Let's add an else statement. If the player is on another scene, we can assume they're playing our game. Our game isn't going to have many scenes. It's safe to display the player info container element. Inside the else block, let's access the player info container.style.display variable. Keep in mind, the display of an element is a style. We can access styles via the style object. In this object, we can access any of the element's styles. In this case, we're directly modifying the display variable. Let's set it to the following: display style.flex. Unity provides values for setting the value of a style. To set the display of an element, we must use display style. Two possible values can be set to the display variable, flex and none. Flex will display the element on the document. None will hide an element. In this example, we're displaying the element, so the flex option makes sense. Next, let's update the main menu container element styles. We're not going to do so from the UI controller component. We'll do so from the state. You may be wondering, why doesn't the player info container element have a state? That's a good question. Unlike other elements, the player info container element should always be visible during gameplay. It's not an interface that can be toggled off. If the player is defeated, it'll stay on the screen. If the game is paused, it'll continue to remain on the screen. Regardless of the current state, the player's info will not go away. Therefore, it doesn't need to be toggled. Let's open the main menu state. At the top of the enter state method, set the controller.mainMenuContainer.style.display property to the following: display style.flex. While we're here, let's update the query for the buttons. Rather than using the controller.root variable, let's use the controller.mainMenuContainer variable. Queries can be performed on child elements. There isn't a limit as to how many queries can be performed. All elements are queryable. We're changing the variables for one simple reason. All our interfaces will be in a single document. In the future, we're going to add more buttons. If we were to select all buttons from the root level, we'd be selecting buttons from other containers. To prevent that from happening, we're updating the query to select buttons from the main menu container. Only buttons from this container will be selected. It's always good practice to be precise with your queries. Let's try testing our game. Switch over to Unity. I'm going to view the main menu scene. Next, I'll play the game. Initially, the main menu appears. The player's stats are nowhere in sight. If I were to start the game, Unity should transition into the next scene. This time, the main menu has gone away, but the player's stats appear on the screen. That's perfect. Since we're not entering a state, the menu will never appear. In the next lecture, let's update the player's stats with the correct values.